morning. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to Ending Epidemics, Escape from Contagion. From the bubonic plague to smallpox and most recently COVID-19, epidemics have always been a staple of human life. As we continue to recover from the COVID pandemic and prepare for the inevitable rise of the next deadly bacteria or virus, there are so many lessons to be learned. Our speaker today is author Richard Conniff, the author of Ending Epidemics, A History of Escape from Contagion. Our moderator, Dr. David Pryor, Anthem California Large and Strategic Accounts, Regional Vice President and Medical Doctor. For those of you who would like to ask questions, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen where you can type in your questions, and we'll take care of that in about 35 minutes. I also want to offer a big thank you to our sponsor today, Keck Medicine of USC. Dr. Pryor, Mr. Conniff, we can't wait for this conversation, so let me turn it over to you, Dr. Pryor.
Well, thank you very much, Kim. It's certainly a pleasure for me to be here today, and I'm looking forward very much to this discussion. Wanted to start off just by congratulating our author, Richard Conniff, for writing this very fascinating book, very timely book, again, Ending Epidemics, A History of Escape from Contagion. So Richard, welcome and congratulations on completing this book.
Thank you, Dr. Pryor. Pleasure to be here.
Definitely. Well, before we dive into some of the topics in the book, I wonder, Richard, if you could just provide us some additional details of your background, where you grew up, maybe some of your educational achievements and professional achievements, and kind of how it led you on this path to write this book. And really, it's, I think, a book about our journey as a society of overcoming and battling against infectious disease outbreaks. But please give us some background.
Sure, happy to do so. So I grew up in New Jersey, outside New York City, and I grew up in a family of writers, always intended to be a writer. And I also grew up in a family where, well, and in a time where infectious diseases were just a part of the story, a routine part of the story. My father and my uncle both had polio in the 1920s when they were toddlers. My uncle had it much worse. He had to get around for the rest of his life on braces. You know, his legs were reduced to twigs. And you know, even when I was a kid in the early 1950s, summer was still polio season. One summer then, 1 year then, 21,000 children, mostly children, were paralyzed by polio, and 3,150, I think, died. And then, you know, the big moment in my life as a child, I think, was that Jonas Salk's polio vaccine became available in 1955. And I was part of that first year. And I found this as I was writing the book, I hadn't expected to find this vaccination certificate, but I did. My parents had kept it in a file with my baptismal certificate because I think for them it was a sacred document. And, you know, after that, summer was no longer polio season, it was just summer. The other infectious disease that I encountered was measles, which everybody got at some point back then. But I got it in a particularly bad year, 1958. My parents thought I was going to die, and 552 kids in this country did die that year. And so that history, and, you know, seeing how things progressed in my own family, in my children's lives, and now in my grandchild's life, made me attuned to the reality that we have lived through a pretty, I hate to say the word miraculous, but a pretty wonderful time in the fight against infectious disease. So anyway, I started out, as I said, I wanted to be a writer. I started out at newspapers, and I switched to magazines and books fairly soon after that. And the other thing that sort of shaped this book was that as I was traveling, I was writing about science mainly, and mainly about the natural world. But as I was traveling, I was seeing infectious disease everywhere. And I have memories of I landed at the Entebbe airport at one point in the middle of the AIDS crisis, and I was going from the airport from Entebbe into Kampala on a taxi, and I was falling asleep on the way. And every time I woke up, I don't know how long a trip was, but it seemed to go on and on. And every time I woke up, what I saw out the window on the side of the road were people selling off open coffins. Um, and again, when I was in India in 2000, polio was still standard there. It was still common. And I remember seeing the streets lined with beggars with their lower limbs folded up underneath them like birds' nests. And they were on makeshift kind of skateboards, and they got around, they had their fists, their hands wrapped in tape, and they would propel themselves around the streets like that. So all these things had a strong influence on me.
Wow. And well, thank you, Rich. That really helps give some context. And so tell us, what is this book about in a nutshell? What is Ending Epidemics about?
So it's about this amazing epic that we have lived through, mainly from the end of the war, World War II on. But if you had told my great grandparents 150 years ago, say, that we would be able to, through medical innovation and through sheer human effort, eradicate smallpox, the deadliest disease known to man, everywhere, forever, and also knock out this murderer's row of diseases like measles and whooping cough and diphtheria and polio, they would have said that it couldn't be done. And if you also told them that it would be possible to double human life expectancy everywhere in less than a century, they would have laughed and said that couldn't be done either. But it happened. And it was the single, to my mind, and to some historians as well, it was the single most dramatic change in all of human history. And yet it's almost completely, maybe not forgotten, but taken for granted. It's a kind of a catch-22 of vaccines, that is, that they, and of all these disease prevention measures, that they prevent diseases, but then they cause us to forget the diseases that they prevent. So most doctors today have never even seen measles, and certainly most average lay people don't see it, and so they don't recognize it as a threat. So what I wrote, the reason I wrote the book is that I wanted to remind people of just how much we have come through, because I consider it essential knowledge for facing the epidemic diseases we're dealing with now and that we will deal with increasingly in the future.
Excellent, excellent. And I think all of us, I know in a minute, we'll, excuse me, talk a little bit about of COVID, how for all of us these last 3 or 4 years, it really, brought everybody into this idea of public health emergencies and infectious diseases and masks. So it really kind of, brought everybody, into that thinking about those type of things. So I think it's very timely. Richard, you say in your book that medical discovery is not linear. It's more of an evolution, branching, confused with lots of false starts and dead ends. Can you maybe expand on that? Give us, as you researched and wrote this book, what do you mean by that it's not linear?
Well, so the big dead end, which lasted for more than 2,000 years, was humoral theory. The idea that our health and our sicknesses were both products of 4 bodily humors, which would get in or out of balance, depending on just a whole wealth of very ill-defined factors. And that kind of being the orthodoxy, it prevented people from thinking about microbial causes of disease, even when they first began to see those microbes. But false starts and evolution and branching, the way, for instance, smallpox prevention developed. So we think of it as starting with Edward Jenner in 1796, when he realized that cowpox was an analog or a cousin of smallpox, and that people who worked in the dairy trade and who got smallpox, or rather cowpox, on their hands had really minor medical effects, but then as a result got lifelong protection from smallpox. And so that was a huge change, but it didn't really begin there. It began centuries, even a millennium earlier, with a practice that was called variolation, where people would actually take scrapings from the pustules of smallpox, and they would look for a person who had a mild case, and then they would scrape them into the skin of a healthy person to cause a mild case of smallpox, which would then also confer lifelong immunity. Really a horribly scary thing to do. To if you're you're taking a healthy child and you're subjecting them to a case of what you know to be the deadliest disease on earth, but you're doing this because you know that it will prevent them from getting a much worse case later on. So those are the kind of things that happen. Polio too was a stop and start. So there was a polio vaccine in 1935, but it was derived from monkey neural tissue, and it caused fatalities in a few children. And after that, for 15 years, people were absolutely terrified of doing anything with the polio vaccine. And it took young researchers to find a way, young researchers who hadn't lived through it and hadn't experienced that trauma, to figure out a way around it that didn't have that bad effect.
Well, it's interesting, Richard, as I was thinking even again about the COVID pandemic we just had, I think there was a lot of impatience of us having all the right answers almost immediately. And I was saying, gosh, this takes time. This was a relatively new virus to us, and and it was questions about, well, is it masking or not masking? Is everybody need to be on ventilators? And I was saying, doctors were kind of learning how to best treat and how to navigate this in real time. And I think that was very interesting when you look at other infectious diseases, HIV. You think back to in the 80s when it took time, and it's to still evolve. How do you treat? How do you not treat? And so I think many times in the society we live in, with instantaneous answers, that we thought, gosh, even this COVID would be have all the right answers day one, when it was really evolving in real time.
But it also evolved incredibly quickly. So with HIV, it was 10 years or more before they got to the antiretroviral drugs that actually began to control the disease. And there's still no vaccine that I think is effective. And with COVID, on the other hand, they were there in 11 months.
Yes. So that just,
it's kind of amazing. And the other thing that's interesting about that is, because people have become so accustomed to being protected from infectious disease, they think that we have natural immunity, or they think that we don't need to social distance, or we don't need to wear masks or do any of these protective measures, when really the reason that they are free from this routine exposure to infectious disease is because vaccines have saved them, have reduced the incidence of those disease. So that's a factor that's contributed to people's impatience, I think.
Exactly. Well, Richard, in your book, there's a chapter I found fascinating. It's called The Great Sanitary Awakening. And you really talk about the role of sanitation, poor sanitation, living conditions, how that has affected infectious disease and infectious disease spread. So, can you give us an idea of the conditions? Let's say, I know you talk about during the Industrial Revolution, how that brought along a lot of great changes for society, but a lot of problems as well, and kind of how the fields of public health and hygiene developed as we tried to control some of these contagions.
Yeah, so the Industrial Revolution, particularly in Britain, brought huge crowds of rural people used to living in rural ways into the cities. The cities had nowhere near enough space for them to live, or really for them to die either, because there were only churchyard cemeteries, and they were quickly being overcrowded because so many people were dying of so many infectious diseases. There wasn't really any adequate freshwater supply. Freshwater supply came out of the River Thames in London, and similarly in other towns and cities across Europe and in North America. And there was no sewage. So these people were living sometimes in basements with whole large rural families packed into a crowded basement. The basements were sometimes flooded with overflowing cesspits outside. There was a guy named Edwin Chadwick who is a forgotten hero. He was a 19th century barrister in London. He was a journalist, and he was a sanitary reformer. And he was one of the most hated people in 19th century London, 19th century England, really, 19th century Britain, I'm sorry. He was hated, first of all, because he was the person who brought about the workhouse system, which put the poor people who couldn't support themselves in conditions that were prison-like, separating husbands from wives and parents from their children. And if you know, one of his worst enemies was Charles Dickens. And if you know Oliver Twist or the musical Oliver, and you know the guy who, Mr. Bumble, who reacts so badly when Oliver asks for another bowl of gruel, well, that was really Edwin Chadwick. He was Dickens' most hated person for being responsible for these workhouses. But Dickens later became Chadwick's greatest convert, because Chadwick's exposure to the lives of the poor, to seeing how they lived and just how wretched the conditions were, and then writing about them in such graphic detail that he exposed to the wealthier people of Britain lives just around the corner that were as alien to them as, you know, the slums of Calcutta. These people were just, you know, they were dying en masse because they were living in such horrible conditions. And he also exposed to them their own vulnerability, because the River Thames was the source of water for them and also the repository for sewage. So, you know, he wrote this document, a kind of great piece of protest literature, which was actually published by the British government printing office. It was called the Sanitary Report, or at least that's the brief name for it, of 1842. And it described these conditions, and it proposed a series of solutions, including bringing in clean water from well up river and making that available citywide, and also moving sewage through a great sewerage system well downriver, and separating the two so that they could reduce the amount of disease. Politicians resisted, of course. The mayor of London at one point said that there could be no improvement in the sanitary arrangements in London because they were already perfect. And 2 years later, 15,000 people died of cholera delivered by that perfect sanitary system. So you know, he was struggling with lots of resistance, but the case he made helped to build the movement for sanitary reform in cities worldwide, in this country and in Europe and then beyond. And so, you know, he's really a great sanitary hero, and that had a dramatic effect on incidence of diseases like typhoid and cholera and other diseases that are waterborne.
And you think, Richard, just of the evolution, right? It almost, to me, was a whole new field of study of science. And I know
Yes.
there was, of course, a lot of great public health schools that developed over time. And I would know they would have this thing, you know, talking about, you know, School of Public Health and Hygiene. And so it, like you said, an evolution as you got people out of rural areas to the cities, the crowded conditions that you didn't think. It's like, wow, something we have to think about, right? How do we put in place, you know, laws, regulations, you know, infrastructure to handle waste and sewage, et cetera. And I imagine, you know, early on, even think about, you know, the meat packing houses and processing centers, right? How do you handle that so that meat isn't infected with bacteria and viruses and have regulations?
Yeah.
So
well, and Chadwick, by campaigning for these things, also began this kind of idea of the importance of a central bureaucracy looking out for the public health. The idea the government would do something about public health before then was pretty unusual.
Exactly. So, Rich, I want to pivot for a minute now and talk about vaccines. Obviously, it plays a big role. And so I want you to provide your thoughts, obviously, on the role of vaccines, what they've had on disease prevention and in some cases, eradication. And we talked about that, were they readily accepted? Again, I always bring it back to current times, so much of some of the controversy we've had with the COVID vaccine. But just talk to us a little bit about vaccines and their role and how people have viewed vaccines through time.
So there was a largely favorable reaction when Edward Jenner introduced the smallpox vaccine in 1796. It quickly became extremely popular across Europe. And then, there was the first global public health initiative was arranged by Spain in about 1800. It covered large portions of the globe. They had to transport the cowpox in one case, they had a boat with 22 orphan boys on it, and the arrangement was that two boys at a time would get the infection with cowpox, and then at a certain point it would be transferred for the next two boys and the next two boys and the next two boys in order to get it across the ocean to Central America. And then you had to keep it alive in all of these places along the way, because cowpox was not a common disease. It was, except in Europe, really. But they did these things. On the other hand, because it was cowpox, there were people who were terrified that they would become cows or they would develop cow-like features. And there was a famous cartoon that came out in about 1802 or so with people with horns and with cows coming out of their back pockets and out of their ears and so on. And so there was fear as well, and resistance as well. And there were anti-vaxxers even before there were vaccines. So in Boston in 1721, Cotton Mather, the minister, was a leader of introducing variolation, this method I mentioned earlier for smallpox prevention. And people were terrified of that. And at one point, somebody actually threw a makeshift bomb through the windows of his house in protest against that. So yeah, there's always been a percentage, a fraction of the public that has resisted and been skeptical and been anti-vaxxers, basically. But over time, even in variolation, what they found in 1721 was that where smallpox was killing 15% of the people who were infected, more than that, much more than that in certain populations, particularly Native Americans. With variolation, they could get it down to 2% that first year, and then down to well below 1%. And so I think people who were patient and paid attention to the science would be persuaded that this was the better way to go.
Better way to go.
Yeah, but you want to know what I think about how about how vaccines have affected the world. I mean, one of the great pleasures for me is looking at these charts of diseases that I came close to, and seeing within 5 years of that Salk vaccine, the chart just of the incident disease in this country just plummeting down to oblivion. Likewise, measles, the vaccine came out 5 years after I had the disease. And again, you see this a high level just go diving down to nothing. And one of the world is that in 1980, for children, for 6 basic childhood vaccines. And so back then, in some countries, as few 5% of the children were getting vaccines. And by 2019, that was up to 86%. Sorry. Are we connected now?
Yeah, I think so. We were having a little bit of audio problem there, but we may have worked it out. And so just wanted to reiterate, we are on talking about the book Ending Epidemics, A History of Escape from Contagion with author Richard Conniff. And Richard, thank you so much. I just wanted to ask you about antibacterial revolution. That's a chapter in your book. And obviously you would think about, any journey of talking about the battle against infectious diseases, the role of antibiotics plays a role. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So the first antibacterial drugs were developed in Germany in the early 1930s. They were sulfa drugs. It's a funny case. Again, you were asking about the stop and start and the branching evolutionary nature of discovery. The German company Bayer that made this discovery thought that the key was in the use of colored dyes, because there was a lot of history of that in Germany in previous research. So they developed sulfa drugs with this azo dye structure and then little changes on the side. And it turned out, as soon as they developed this drug and started to produce successful results, the French found out that you could completely get rid of the azo dye structure and just concentrate on that sidearm, the sulfa, and get the exact same results. And so the Germans immediately lost their patent. It became a worldwide sensation in the 1930s. The doctor who discovered it or who developed it, a guy named Gerhard Domack, he was actually able to use it that first year, 1935, because his daughter had a terrible accident with a sewing needle, and she developed systemic infection, and the doctor wanted to amputate her arm, and her father said, no, let's try this. And they did try it, and it saved her arm and probably her life as well. The other great sensation with that antibacterial treatment was in the UK, a doctor named Maeve Kenny in London. One of the first times you see a woman's name as the author of a paper. She was an obstetrician, and she administered this drug to women who had just given birth, who had childbed fever, which was horribly fatal in so many cases. She found that it reduced the fatality rate from 26% down to, I think, about 5%. And it was all because of sulfa drugs. And in one case, she administered it to a woman with a higher level of infection than she had previously seen, except in the terminal stages of fatal cases. And that woman was not only cured, she walked out of the hospital completely normal in 3 weeks. But the sulfa drugs were really only, I'm sorry, there's one other thing. In this country, the drug got started because FDR's son, the president's son, in 1935, developed a throat infection. It became front page news. He was near death. He was administered the sulfa drugs, and it again saved his life. But the sulfa drug is really only the beginning. In the 1930s, late 1930s, British researchers were developing penicillin, that only became it didn't become available actually until 1944, but it first started to be tested in the early 1940s, and it was very difficult to extract and produce, and finally they had to get American manufacturers, American researchers involved to start to produce it, not in small bedpans is what they're actually using in the beginning. Instead, they switched to these huge vats, 7,000-gallon vats, that sort of thing. And it was such a international effort that they were able to produce thousands of doses for D-Day. And it's one of the reasons we were able to win the war.
Wow, amazing. And I know some of the uses of antibiotics on the battlefield, right? In wars, when people are getting shot and getting infectious and diseases and dirt, right? That's been a very much a game changer even in those areas over time.
Yes.
Richard, I want everybody to know it's going to be about maybe 10 more minutes of discussion, and we're going to have some time for questions and answers. So please, if you have questions for Richard, questions about the book, please, I'll queuing you up for that kind of ahead of time. Just a few more comments and questions, Richard. One of the things I thought very interesting in your book, you talk a little bit about some of the personal lives and the makeup of these scientific trailblazers, right? The people who have gone down in history as the ones that, hey, they discovered this vaccine, or they came up with this cure for a disease. That sometimes it's I would say it's marketing, it's politics, it's a lot of things that go on into that history. Can you talk to us a little bit about what you've discovered looking at some of these contributors over time?
Yeah, so the first thing is that there is no, the idea that there is a lone genius, or that somebody is suddenly struck with a great idea that changes the world overnight, is almost non-existent. Edward Jenner was not the great originator of all of the end of smallpox, and Jonas Salk was not alone in originating the polio vaccine. There's an army of other people hidden behind the scenes who typically don't get credit. In particular, women don't get credit. There was a woman named Isabel Morgan in the 1940s who developed the same type of vaccine that Salk later brought to market, and her vaccine demonstrated that it was possible to prevent polio in monkeys. And she never made the leap to testing in children because of it's not clear why she didn't do it. She got married at that time. Maybe it was because married women weren't supposed to continue working. She had a stepchild she had to take care of, who had a mental handicap of some sort. And also, women, her own story, women, there was one of her bosses who said simply, well, lady PhDs didn't generally get very far in our institution, and she didn't. She actually moved on to Johns Hopkins, where she got a lot farther. But yeah, there were a lot of obstacles. So yeah, lots of different people involved, lots of people not getting credit. And then the other thing about them is that there is no single type. So some people are intensely career-oriented, like Jonas Salk and Louis Pasteur, and others. Edward Jenner was completely opposed to ambition. He didn't want to be anything other than a country doctor. He did not want money. He did not want fame, and yet he saved more lives than anybody who ever lived. And that's just, I think, what they all had in common. Jenner in particular, but lots of others as well, was this ability to see what was happening in front of their faces and to think about it. Jenner was very good about listening to his patients and thinking about what they told him, seeing their symptoms, seeing in that case, their immunity to smallpox, and making sense of it. But others that are less famous also did that. They could see something that others were resisting, or that others didn't see because they were caught up in some orthodoxy. So there was a guy named James Paget, who was just a medical student in the 1830s, maybe 1840s. And he was a student at an autopsy, and they were cutting through the subject, and they were encountering this gritty texture in the muscle. And the doctors that were teaching him said that was basically a nuisance that caused their scalpels to dull. But he thought there was something more to it. So he took a sample home with him, took it over to the Natural History Museum, actually, which had the only microscopes that were available, looked through the microscope and saw that the grit, those were actually cysts, and each of the cysts contained a little worm, and that worm was the basis of, sorry, it's slipping my mind now, the disease that's associated with eating raw pork, trichinosis.
Yes.
And so that's how that was discovered, because somebody had the clarity of vision to see what was in front of them and to think about it more closely. And all of these people were able one way or another to do that. And that was kind of the key.
To contribute. Wow, that's amazing to really think about, that, because I think we do in our mind in history looks back to one person that had this great breakthrough, but like you say, often teamwork, often many years of people thinking about things, but it's that the curiosity, it seems like the curiosity to say, well, what about this? Let's not just accept something, let's dig a little deeper. And that was able to open up a lot of new discovery, it seems like.
Yeah, one other thing is that sometimes people would see things perfectly clearly, like germ theory. But in that case, the particular case I'm thinking of from the 1850s, his research was germ theory was ready for the world. The world was not ready to accept germ theory. So it's also a matter of having the right timing. It's a matter of luck in a way.
One last question, Richard, before we open it up to questions from the audience. As you've, again, researched very thoroughly on this book and kind of put together the story of how we have ended epidemics and how we've gotten through that, as you look at the world now, and in particular, think about some of the sanitation challenges that are faced in different parts of the world, right? For as much as we know what prevents disease and illness, but we're all not there at the same level, right? And what's your thoughts on different places of the world that still are very far behind in some of these basic hygiene practices, et cetera?
Well, so in basic hygiene, 2 billion people in the world, more than 2 billion people in the world, lack access to clean drinking water at home. 4.5 billion people, that's the majority of people on Earth, lack adequate sanitary disposal. And the problem with that is that those people are then vulnerable to all the old waterborne diseases like cholera, like typhoid, like polio, which is almost on the brink of extinction, but not quite there yet. And so those childhood vaccines that I mentioned earlier are really much more important for them because they haven't got the protection of proper sanitary arrangements. And the other thing is that making those sanitary arrangements can seem like a major challenge. But I like to think about eradication of smallpox, which happened in the 1970s. It happened over a period of 10 years, and everybody thought it was impossible, but they did it. And the US Surgeon General at the time commented on the people who did it. And the comment was somewhat disparaging, although also admiring. He said, the people who did it were simply too young to know it couldn't be done. And so things like taking care of sanitation worldwide may seem like it's something that cannot be done, but we just need to think bigger, and we need to assemble that army of young people who don't know and don't care that it cannot be done, and they will do it.
Wow, that's great. That's a great way to put it all together and put it into perspective. But with that, I want to open it up, turn it over to Rachel on the team, and open it up to any questions that might be posed by the audience.
Yes, thank you both so much for being here, and to our audience for submitting questions. We've had a number of them come in about vaccines, so I want to start with this one. There's been a recent distrust of vaccines by the public. What has caused this, and how do you think trust in vaccines can be rebuilt?
Well, I think there's been a systematic effort to sow misinformation about vaccines, and the terrible thing about that is that people die as a result. Social media have made it so much easier to spread misinformation. So that if you are already of a very skeptical nature, you don't trust science, you don't trust government, then somebody feeds you some some plausible sounding information on social media, and you're likely not just to accept it, but to spread it yourself, and it's very easy to do. So I think that's the big problem that we've got going. And you know, there are things that are just resist science, resist proof, resist evidence to such an extent that it's hard to figure out how to deal with that. So in the case of the MMR vaccine for measles, you know, and the alleged connection to autism, well, there have been dozens of studies showing that there is no connection to autism, that it just doesn't correlate at all. And in the most recent of them, they studied 635 children to look for increased incidence of autism in children who had received the MMR vaccine, and there wasn't any increased incidence. On the other hand, if you were to get measles, you have like a 1 in 1,000 risk of developing encephalitis, of pneumonia. You have a high likelihood in that same range of developing permanent neurological damage. And because people have forgotten just how risky the disease is, they are more willing to be skeptical about the extremely small risk of a vaccine. And it's just, you know, the trick is to weigh risks. You know, you're not going to avoid any risk, but to weigh the risk and to think about what you're exposing your child to by leaving them unprotected. So in 2019, I forget what the exact number was, but I think it was 1,200 parents of 1,200 children made the wrong choice. There was an outbreak of measles in this country. This was 20 years after the disease was eliminated from this country. An outbreak of measles, and 124 of those kids had to be hospitalized. Fortunately, none of them died. But you know, that's what you're risking with your kid, because of some idea about autism that was put out by a doctor who was in cahoots with a lawyer suing drug companies. So it's just, I mean, it's sad, it's dangerous. People die as a result.
You actually answered the question I was going to ask next. We had one come in about where people get information that vaccines cause autism. So thank you for sharing that as well.
It was published originally in The Lancet in the 1990s. That original study, it was retracted by the Lancet, and all of the co-authors in that study also retracted the article. That is, they said that it was wrong to publish. It was a mistake. And there's only this one doctor out there who continues to spout the same untruths and to cause people a great deal of suffering as a result. I should say one of the early campaigns with the measles vaccine was in the country that's now called Burkina Faso in West Africa. And the fatality rate from measles then, because of the conditions in which kids were living, was 25%. 25% of kids who got measles died. And so when that measles vaccine became available to them, parents traveled from villages all around to be able to get their kids protected, because they knew just how bad the disease could be. And I do too, actually, because I lived through it. It's terrible. Sorry.
Right. No, completely fine. That's an incredible mortality rate. So that's good information. Kind of on a related note, how do we separate vaccines from politics? They've become so political in the last few years. So how can we kind of undo that change?
Yeah, this is, David, I can maybe start off on that one a little bit as well. But yeah, I think that it is tough that our politics and science is kind of intertwined at this point. And so I think certainly, obviously, you saw that mostly with this COVID vaccine. And so, you know, a couple of things, my thoughts are obviously, you know, want to try to keep most of the science into the hands of the scientists and others. and really try to stick to the facts. I think part of what I saw in the COVID vaccine is that there was this mistrust by many people going into it, right? And for some of those cases, some people, the mistrust was warranted, right? As in our United States government has not always been as clear and ethical about how we've done, how we provided treatment and how we've done studies and et cetera, right? So some of that is true, but how do you overcome that, right? Overcome that, I think, with the truth, and I think being vulnerable to say, we don't know everything about, about, let's say, a vaccine or a treatment. But as Richard said, it's kind of the whole overall risk and benefit, right? Because even COVID, some of the folks that maybe didn't want the vaccine would say, well, a couple people had, myocarditis or an inflammation around the heart, right? So I guess the fact of, if you give 300 million doses of a vaccine, right? Are there going to be a small number of people that might have a side effect? Yes. But I guess being honest with that, but as you say, it's the risk, the overall benefit versus the risk is, I think, important. And so I think it's going to be an ongoing battle about how do you keep, politics out of science. But I think that a lot of us who are in the scientific field, and doctors, nurses, others, is really doing, I myself did a lot of webinars and really just try to communicate openly and honestly, hey, this is what we know. These are the studies we've done on this vaccine. We believe it's safe because of X, Y, and Z. Here's the benefits of it. Are there any risks? Like I said, everything in medicine, there's somewhat of a risk, right? Even something as simple as an appendectomy. If you have appendicitis, the doctor will tell you, well, we think this is going to be 99.9% effective. It's going to get the appendix out. But could there always be a complication? Yes, so there's always a little bit of a risk with everything in medicine. So that's my approach. But Richard, any thoughts from your perspective?
My thought is that that's a great answer, Dr. Pryor.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Yes, thanks for jumping in there, Dr. Pryor.
Yeah.
Another audience member asked, could you talk a little about diseases that were controlled without vaccines or even effective treatment and how that was done? Tuberculosis is a good example.
Well, tuberculosis is oddly not controlled. It's certainly better in this country and in Europe, but as COVID fades away, it is resuming its place as the biggest killer of human beings everywhere. It's got I think 1.5 million people a year die of the disease. And antibiotics obviously made the story much better, particularly in the developed world. And again, all of these things tend to benefit the developed world first, and then maybe even a little reluctantly, we share them with other parts of the world, and that has to change. In the case of tuberculosis now, in the beginning, the penicillin treatment or the antibiotic treatment for tuberculosis was long and extraordinarily painful. George Orwell had the disease and died of it when he was like 45, I think. Up until now, the treatment for antibiotic resistant cases has taken 2 years. And if you think about when you've taken antibiotics and all the side effects that has, and just the indigestion and all that, taking that for 2 years has caused many people not to follow through on the treatment. And they've now reduced that 2 years just recently to 6 months. And that will make a big difference in controlling the disease. And they have also just developed a better diagnostic method, a quicker diagnostic method. So instead of taking weeks, it takes a couple of hours. And that will enable people in the field to reach the 40% of tuberculosis victims who never actually get medical care at all, because they just pass unprotected. The other thing about leaving a disease like TB to sort of go on as if it doesn't matter is that when HIV became a problem, the combination of TB and HIV and AIDS. It's now the single biggest killer of people with AIDS. It's just when you leave these diseases lying as if they are beaten here and we don't need to think about them anymore, well, there's always a risk that they can come charging back. So I'm sorry, this is away from antibiotics a little bit, but having polio turn up in this country in 2022, when God Almighty, it was gone from this country from 1970s on. It's just a horrible, shocking thing that when we don't take these diseases seriously and either knock them down or knock them out when we can, we're making a big mistake. Sorry, I've gotten away from antibiotics. Did I answer that question well enough for you?
Yes, no, that was great. Thank you.
Okay.
Our next question, how does homelessness in US cities impact the spread of diseases?
Yeah, I'll take a quick stab at that. The homeless, I always tried to make it contemporary. A few years ago, probably right before the pandemic, we saw a spike in hepatitis cases. In particular, one of the areas I know out here was in San Diego, and they had a real public health emergency there, and they tied some of it to a lot more homeless people in San Diego. You had, feces on the ground, on the cement there, back to the sanitation issues, right? Of not having places to go. So I think some cities tried to say, gosh, maybe we need to put out more of the, portable potty, portable restrooms and have a place to wash your hands there. So I think that, and I'd love to get Richard's the tie into sanitation. When you have homeless people that can't do the proper hygiene, certainly can lead to the spread of disease, and we've seen that. But Richard?
Yeah, well, so the other thing that occurs to me is that because we had knocked down so many of these infectious diseases that are a problem normally, or had been a problem for our parents and grandparents, states stopped funding their public health programs at the same level. So where there used to be routine testing for all kinds of things and treatment available for people who are homeless or otherwise not normally reached by medical care, those programs have gone away. And that was a problem not just for the homeless, but for everybody during COVID-19. And really states, the idea is that it doesn't, you think you can get by without a public health department, a proper public health program, but then you're stuck when a crisis comes, and you don't want to be in the position of building a firehouse when the fire's already started. You want to have it there on the scene doing the important work.
Yeah, and I think so. And I think even the other implications around homelessness, we saw that with, even back in with HIV and even, needles, and this idea of clean needles, and how do people, again, that are on the streets, if they are doing any type of drugs, that plays a role too, right? And they don't have, proper even needles. And so there's a lot of implications there. And I know a lot of medical providers are starting to have these kind of street medical teams that actually go out into the field and treat people, because as Richard said, people could have a cut, an infection, and it gets dirt in it, right? Something easily that can be maybe controlled with antibiotics, but you have to be able to get those antibiotics to people. So there's a whole lot behind that.
Yeah.
Thank you both. I think we have time for one or two more questions. So the first one is, how has society's relationship with death evolved since disease has become less prevalent?
Wow. Reading Edwin Chadwick's account of how people lived in the 19th century, one of the things that was most shocking for me was, well, first of all, death was very familiar. There was this one great scene that Chadwick describes in which he goes into a slum, and at one point he's sitting there talking with a mother, and he says, my God, the undertaker is never absent from this place. And the mom replies, no, nor the midwife either. And he goes on to make this great statement about how disease doesn't reduce the pressure of population. Disease and death don't cause a Malthusian benefit for society by reducing the population. They actually cause more reproduction because people are having kids to replace kids to replace kids because they're dying all the time. And back then, the mortality rate before age 5 was about 1 in 3 would die before they reached age 5, a pretty appalling thing. And so mothers would put this enormous effort into raising these children only to see them die. And the result was that if you wanted to have a family and have somebody live to maturity, you had to have 5, 6, 10 kids. And you read these families' stories. So if you look at somebody like Pasteur, or you look at Anthony van Leeuwenhoek, who was the first person to describe a bacteria because he was a microscopist. He was good at using microscopes. Then you see that van Leeuwenhoek's 5 children died, his wife died, his father and his stepfather died. There was just death throughout their lives as a startling factor. I said that the death rate then for children was 1 in 3 before age 5. Well, today it's in the 1990s, I think it was like 1 in 10, not that long ago, and now it's 1 in 20. It's 1 in 26, I think, worldwide, more like 1 in 100 in this country. So yeah, death was far more familiar then, than it is to us now. So I think that when I saw the COVID news in March of 2020, and it was about New York City, and they were using earth moving equipment to lift up dead bodies and move them to different locations. That was what really got me and made me realize that this was a world-changing event. But before that, we just don't see death the way they did.
So interesting. Thank you. I want to get to one more question about the book just before we close out. But who was the most interesting historical figure you learned about while writing Ending Epidemics?
They were all interesting in different ways. So, Louis Pasteur was an incredible visionary for being able to go from one small industrial research project to another, to another, to another, and to go from, I think he was looking at fermentation and an off taste in a sugar product made from root beets. And from there, he went on to how fermentation works, to spontaneous generation, to germ theory, to developing the first vaccines since Jenner. And he was terrific at that. He was also terrific, however, at exploiting other people's ideas. And he was just a total blunderbuss in a political argument. He would take his rivals and pop holes in them with an incredibly fierce rhetoric. So that was interesting to me. Edward Jenner was interesting to me for an entirely different reason. As a young man, he liked to dress incredibly well. He liked to write light verse. He liked to hang around with Samuel Taylor Coleridge and other literary types. He wrote a poem about his favorite beer. He was not a guy that you would expect would save more people than anyone who ever lived, but he did. And so, yeah, they're just an incredible range of types. In the 1940s, there were 2 women named Pearl Kendrick and Grace Eldering. They worked in one of those state labs I mentioned, in one of those state public health programs. They were doing lowly kind of experiments. One of them was interested in studying a single disease, and she settled on whooping cough. And her boss said to her that she could study that after hours if it amused her. Her male boss said that, and it did amuse her. And she developed a vaccine at a time when no successful vaccine developed by male counterparts existed, and went on to stop a disease that was then killing 4,000 children every year in the United States and tens of thousands worldwide. And but it didn't become the Kendrick Eldering vaccine They refused to put their names on it. They said that there were too many other people involved and that it would be unfair. And they were incredibly modest about it. And I think that was partly because as women, they were trained to be modest and it was sort of enforced on them. And so I find them very interesting characters too, and admirable, obviously.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And thank you both again. I'll turn it back over to you, Dr. Pryor, to close us out.
Yes, well, great. This hour went by very quickly. Again, the book is Ending Epidemics, A History of Escape from Contagion. The author is Richard Conniff. I think there's a link in here of where to purchase the book, where to pick it up at. I think it's a fascinating read. And certainly from my perspective, it's not a subject that it's a period, right? This is an ongoing, we're going to continue to deal with epidemics, pandemics in the future. So I think it'd be a good read to kind of have that history. Richard, any last word?
No, I think this is great. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this, David, and all of you in the audience as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Kim, I don't know if you have anything else you wanted to add?
You both are amazing. This discussion was so interesting and so important to put everything in historical perspective, remembering pieces of this, but this was so educational. Thank you both for such a great conversation.